Oh, hi. I didn't see you there. I was just thinking about how we're going to build this dry stream bed to capture the water from our classroom building here in the demonstration garden at the Waterwise Community Center. So if you want to join us, today we'll show you how we build it. For a long time, we've had a situation here where when it rains, a lot of the water that comes off the roof just kind of flows past this area. In a big rain, it'll kind of flood this bed a little bit. And then in a larger rain, it'll even go off and flood this pathway area. And for quite a while, there wasn't really anything we can do about it because we had a big fig tree right here. But we recently removed the fig tree because it actually didn't produce good tasting figs. And now we have the opportunity to build a water capture feature that's going to make the most use of this rainwater when it falls, capture it in the garden, hydrate this area, and help solve our small flooding issue right here. So we're going to take you through step by step. We're going to start with laying out this area. Then we'll show you how we dig and build it. And then finally, we will do some rock work to make it look nice and do some planting and then reattach the drip irrigation system for this area. Having made our observations through a few rain events, seeing where this area floods, the natural flow of the water when it rains, our next step is to decide the shape and how we want to lay out our dry stream bed. This video is mostly about the construction of the dry stream bed itself. For much more information about how to do an assessment of your entire property, understand where the water is coming from, and get ideas about how you can capture that water and design those features, check out our Rainwater Harvesting for Home Landscapes online workshop, or come visit us in person when we teach that live here at the Waterwise Community Center. But for now, we're just going to do a quick layout. And so the main considerations that we are thinking about are where our water source comes from and where we want the water to exit should we have a large rain event and this small area isn't able to capture and hold on to all of that water. In most cases, if that water is not causing a large problem in the current situation, when it leaves the area in the natural direction of the flow, that's generally where you probably want your overflow. So for instance, in this example, although it's a little bit inconvenient when this path area floods, that's very much in a large storm event where the water wants to go. This area is relatively flat, but that side is higher than this side, which is a little bit kind of downslope. The water naturally wants to go that way, and there's no huge issue when it occurs. And so as we plan out our dry stream bed, we're not going to have to mound up a lot of soil to change the natural flow of the water in this particular situation. We're mostly just going to dig down. We want a nice kind of organic, natural looking shape. And then should there be too much water to capture in this feature, we're going to allow it just to overflow in its natural direction. Now, if your property has much more of a slope, if you need to do more work moving earth to hold onto that water, definitely check out our Rainwater Harvesting for Home Landscapes online workshop, where we go much more in depth about those rainwater capture features that might need a little bit more consideration in terms of their layout. But in a lot of cases, for the average home, if you have a downspout, or you've replaced it with a rain chain that's dropping to the ground level, it can remain pretty simple, especially if you don't have a lot of slope to your site. And so that's the condition we have. Now we know that we are going to run into some roots probably from this old fig tree, and we'll deal with those as we get to them. And so we have a few options for how we want to kind of lay out and visualize the shape. You always want to get your shape laid out on the ground before you start digging. One great option for community members using something that you probably already have on hand is to use a garden hose to outline your shape. You definitely want to leave your hose in the sun for a little while to get it to warm up a little bit, make it a little bit more pliable. It's relatively cold this morning, so it's going to be a little stiff, and so we'll see what we can do. But the hose is nice because you can sort of lay out your rough shape, and then you can adjust it as you go. So let's see if this hose will cooperate. And so you can start by just laying it out through the general area, untwisting it as you go. laying it out as flat as possible. And this is going to be nowhere near our finished shape, but the first thing is to just get it all out into the general area. And then you can start to create the shape of your dry stream bed. And so you always want to think about what are your existing factors to make your life easier. So one of our existing things we need to consider is we're going to have a lot of roots near that stump. Hopefully we won't need to dig out that stump. The idea is we can just leave that stump, those roots to decompose over time, and we can build and plant around it. And so as we think about the natural kind of nice sinuous shape through that area, generally you start a little bit narrower right at your downspout or your source of your water, and then you get a little bit wider as you go. You always want to have, generally if you have any sort of edge, at least 1.5 feet or so, minimum a foot away from the edge before you start digging down into your dry stream bed area, because you don't want to have a steep fall off right at the edge where someone could kind of twist their ankle and fall into the dry stream bed. Coming around to our existing trees, you always want to minimize the impact to the root zone of any existing vegetation. If you have a large mature tree, in general, you don't want to try to dig one of these new features or a dry stream bed or do any real significant digging or trenching into the root zone of an established tree. So we're going to hold our digging to outside the canopy of this pomegranate. Now pomegranate happens to be a very tough tree, so it can probably take some root disturbance, but we're not going to try to get too close. And then we'll come back around and back in. And so this is not really a graceful line, but this is something similar to the shape that we are going to have. And we can adjust it from here. It doesn't need to get super specific. In reality, for a space this small, I probably wouldn't go through this part, and I'd probably just skip to the next method that I will show you. But this method is really, really useful for larger dry stream bed areas where it's kind of going to go maybe across a yard or across a property, and it's not that easy to kind of visualize ahead of time the exact layout. And over time, you can kind of tweak these if you really want to get it perfect. But for now, I'll just kind of leave that as a technique. You can kind of see the general flow, and then from here, you would get more specific or more detailed about how exactly you want the curves to go. The next method, which you can combine with the hose for the basic layout, or just do it from scratch if that's more your style, is just to use the point of a shovel, a spade, and start to just kind of freehand draw the outline of where you think you might want your edges of your feature to go. And so we'll start by just doing a more kind of rounded version of our hose line. We'll get the hose out of the way. And now we'll take a step back, look at it, and then try to start to make it look nice looking. So far we've just been thinking about function. And now we're going to start to think about making a nice curve to the line. And one of the things I like about this method is if you kind of adjust your line, you can then just kind of erase with your shovel as well. Come through here. Kind of adjust this back in a little bit more, just a little bit farther away from the stump of the fig. And you don't need to get it perfect in this phase, because as you're digging, as eventually you're going back and maybe adding in some rock or cobblestone to after you dig, you have plenty of chances to kind of tweak the shape as you go. And then the last thing that sometimes I like to do, and especially it's something I like to do if I'm going to have any help from other people digging the feature, is to do something to really highlight the final line that we are going to dig along. So my favorite thing to do to highlight that line is to grab an old bag of just baking flour and sprinkle that along the line. Just makes a nice white chalk line with something you're likely to have on hand. However, we don't do a lot of baking here at the demonstration garden, so I don't happen to have a bag of flour on hand, but I do have a bag of organic fertilizer, which we're not putting down to fertilize, but it's a nice kind of powder that I can use to just sort of highlight the edge to make sure that everyone's going to be on the same page when we start digging. So now that we have our basic layout, we're getting close to being ready to actually dig out our dry stream bed. A couple of notes before we do that is you want to have a general idea of how deep you want to dig before you go in. Generally, if you have the ability to do so, you want to choose an area for the main pooling of your water that's at least 10 feet or so away from your foundation. That's not always an option, but that's the goal. And part of how you achieve that, as the dry stream bed moves away from the point of water, oftentimes a roof drain downspout or a rain chain, is to have the bottom of the dry stream bed be a little bit shallower, closer to the source of the water, which is usually closer to the house. And then as it moves away, the bottom of the dry stream bed can slope down a little bit to a little bit of a deeper depth in your main pooling area. And you don't need to go overboard. In terms of the amount of actual water depth when it is raining and when the dry stream bed is full, most residential properties will only have 6 inches to maybe a foot or so of actual standing water. But remember, to do that, if you're going to be putting stone and rock in the bottom, you might need to dig that out a little bit deeper. Also remember, depending on the size of the gravel or the rock you're working with, you might want to dig out a little bit wider to make room for the rock and then have a nice gentle slope to the bottom of your dry stream bed. Depending on the space you're working with, you might need to stack rocks a little bit more vertically. You might be able to have a nice gentle slope. And so we'll sort of get into that as we start to dig. Now, when it comes to the actual digging part, it's important to have the right tool and know how to use it to make yourself as efficient as possible and make sure that you don't get sore any faster than you need to. So the tool for this job is almost always going to be a spade, just a traditional pointed shovel. If all you have is a flat shovel, you're going to have to go out and get a pointed shovel, because this is really how you're going to be able to make progress digging into the ground. The flat shovels are good for transferring materials, moving a pile of soil, moving a pile of gravel, but not for digging into the ground. And with this pointed shovel, if you have to go out and buy a new one, you want to make sure that you get one with a nice step plate, because part of the action of digging the shovel is going to be stepping down or really even kicking down on this with your shoe. On that note, proper footwear is very important. If you have a pair of boots, wear them. It will make the work easier. If you don't have a pair of boots, that's just fine, but definitely wear a sturdy pair of shoes and prepare for them to get dirty. Never try to do work doing real digging with a shovel with flip-flops or sandals on, because it can be very easy to cut the side of your foot once you're really kicking into this thing to dig. Because proper digging is really all about using your lower body weight and the large muscles in your leg with the pressure of your foot. Sometimes people who are digging, who don't do a lot of digging, try to do a lot of the work with their shoulders, and they're stabbing down into the ground. And that is a really good way to either, one, not make a lot of progress, and two, tire yourself out very quickly. So I'm going to show you the kind of standard way of digging with the shovel. You're going to want to put your shovel down roughly where you're starting. And here I'm going to go just a little bit farther out from our line because we're going to try to have a nice gentle slope. And once you have your shovel placed, you want to kick down on this kick plate with a good amount of force. And you can see how easily that sunk in. If I was just pushing with my shoulders, I would not be able to as efficiently get this blade of the shovel down into the soil. And then when you lift, you want to lift with the large muscles in your legs and not use your back. You want to keep your back as straight as possible. If you start lifting with your back muscles, you're going to tire yourself out really quickly. The large muscles in your legs are what are made to do this sort of sustained work. And so you basically just squat down with your knees a little bit, keep your back straight, and then lift using your leg muscles, take a step, and then deposit that soil into your wheelbarrow or whatever you're using to collect that soil. As you're digging a dry stream bed, what I normally like to do is I like to start by digging down and just sort of starting to define the edge, not really worrying about getting any exact shape or exact depth. You might hit a rock. If you do hit rocks, generally, sometimes might need to go farther back and kind of kicking down and wiggling that shovel around, feeling for the size of the rock. This is a pretty large one here. Occasionally, you might need to go as far, especially if you have really rocky soil, of using more of a pick type tool to rough out the space before digging out. Oftentimes, though, you don't need to go that far. If you do, the main thing with using a pick to remember is that you're also still wanting to use your leg muscles, not your back muscles, and definitely wear safety glasses if you do that. But we'll see if we can get this just with the shovel. And you kind of find the edge and you start lifting like a lever. If you're just trying to stab down into it, it'll take forever. So feel for the edge, then lift out. And this will be a beautiful rock for us to use in our dry stream bed. So start making a pile of rocks off to the side. And sometimes you'll get a nice variety of different stone to mix in and add to your feature. One other situation you might run into is needing to deal with some roots. Now, like I mentioned before, you always want to absolutely minimize impact on roots of living trees. You never want to saw through roots even this big. Generally, you don't want to saw through any main roots, but this root happens to be one that belonged to that old fig tree that's no longer here, and it is right in the way of our path of where we need to dig for our dry stream bed. And so generally, unless the roots are small, less than half an inch for sure, anything larger than that, you usually don't want to just try to muscle through with a shovel. It's not that efficient. And oftentimes you don't want to get it out like an axe or a pick and just start kind of wailing on it, because that's actually not that efficient either. The tool is often just going to be bouncing off the root, and you need to use a lot of force and a lot of energy to do it. So what I prefer is to dig out some around the roots and then use a small pruning saw to more precisely cut that root. And so you can see I've got most of the dirt out. I'm going to need to go a little bit farther back because I want to cut this old root where it's going to be out of the way of our dry stream bed. So I need to dig out a little bit more so I can make my cut right here. And so now I'm going to make my cut about right here. You can see it's divided into two slightly smaller roots, and you can see there's some play to it. But I don't want to just try to rip this thing out of the ground. That'll start getting more into the root zone of this pomegranate than I want. And so using a pruning saw is a great way to do kind of more precise surgical root. This is a small folding one, a Corona pruning saw. These are pretty good for the price. You don't need to spend an arm and a leg on a pruning saw. And if you happen to have a really nice one, you might not want to be down in the soil where you might be hitting rocks and gravel. So it's good to have a cheap one. Can be even smaller than this for doing some sort of more dirty work down close to the ground. when you're working with a pruning saw, the most important thing is to always know where your other hand is and don't have it anywhere near the path of the saw. And then you can kind of just get going slowly. And if you want, you can dig out more to have more room, but generally I start pretty slowly. Go from there. If you happen to have a loppers or a pruner in your pocket, you can probably just do the last part of this from there, but I'll just use the saw because that's what I have with me. Now that there's a lot of flex on it, the last part is giving me a little bit of trouble. So I'll go around and I'll cut from the other side to finish it off. And there we go. And now you can kind of peel that backwards and that'll be out of the way. And we'll have to cut it on the other side eventually as it gets closer. So now that we've got things started, we've taken a look at the techniques, we have our basic layout, I'm gonna go get the rest of our Waterwise Community Center garden crew, and we are all going to chip in digging this thing out because many hands make light work. If you are doing this and you have access to friends or family to help make this happen, it'll absolutely go faster and be more fun. But if you're doing it by yourself, you definitely can do that. Just chip away at it. Don't need to get it done in one day and slowly work on it as we have time. One quick note as you get going on the digging process. So we like to start with digging out a sort of slanted with the angle of the edge trench along the outside. But then as you get to digging out the middle, it's always going to be easier to be digging from the center of your dry stream bed with the shovel then lifting out into the area that you already dug out because there's less resistance from the soil. So after digging out your edge, we'll generally hop into the middle, and then the digging, as long as you don't hit too many roots, becomes much easier as it goes. So now we're partway through digging out the hole for our dry stream bed. And you can see that up at the top, closer to the downspout, the water source, that we are shallower, and then we get slowly deeper to our finished pooling area. But when you're partway through, it's a good time to take a step back and see what you want to do for your final depths. So starting up at the top, somewhat shallow actually works just fine because what we want to do is we only need a couple inches of pooling area, and then we're trying to push the water away from the structure down to our final infiltration area where it gets wider. But in this section in between right here, starting maybe about here, we can go a little bit deeper so that in a big storm event, when the water rises in the dry stream bed, we can get a little bit more capacity here. Up where we started narrow, where we didn't have that much room, we would have had to dig basically a really deep trench to have much pooling area. And so once we get a little bit wider, we can also go down a little bit deeper. So we might be looking for maybe 9-10 inches of total depth here. And as you're going, it can be really hard to eyeball how deep things are. When you just pull out a measuring tape, it's really hard to eyeball where the surface level actually is to see your depth. And so what I like to do is I like to take anything long and flat to use as a guide. If you have a rake, that normally works pretty well, pretty long handle. And so it's easy to lay across, and then you can just measure down to check your measurement. So here, we actually only have about 6 inches of depth so far. So we're probably going to want to go 3 or 4 inches further down. And then once you get to your wider area, it can be quite difficult to check the depth. And so same thing, we'll lay that across and we'll see how we're doing. So here we are at about 7 inches, and we are going to be aiming to go quite a bit deeper than that. We're going to be aiming to be at least a foot, probably closer to 15, 16 inches. And sometimes you might set a goal for how deep you get, and then you start digging and seeing your sides and what you have to work with. And maybe you aren't going to be able to get quite that deep in the middle, but we'll keep going for quite a while. We'll try to get a number of more inches in here, and we'll see how it looks. At this point, we've done most of our volume of digging out soil. We've reached the closest to our goal depth as we can get, while still not having a really deep vertical hole in the ground. By the time we fill this with rock and soil, it's going to look a lot less steep. But there's one last final touch I usually like to do when we have a relatively constrained space and we're trying to put a dry stream bed in. If we had a much wider area, we could have had a much more gradual slope to get down to our depth in a much wider feature. But because we're relatively constrained here, as we dug, we ended up with not a completely vertical, but a pretty vertical slope. And so thinking ahead to our next step, we're going to be adding rock of all sorts of different sizes, from gravel to, especially along the sides, cobblestones, and maybe even a few small boulders. And this is pretty vertical. If we needed to, we could literally stack stones on top of each other and make it work. But oftentimes I'd like to go back as one last step and to sort of roll off the edge so that when the rock comes in, it can have kind of a nicer, more natural form. And so that's pretty simple. I just kind of come back at the end and I just kind of shave off the edge at the top. And then we'll come back and we'll dig the soil back out. Now that we've dug out our dry stream bed, it's time to add back in some rock and gravel for a nice naturalistic and aesthetically appealing look. Now, this is optional. You don't necessarily need to add rock. Sometimes the same shape without the rock in is called a swale, and it'll work pretty well to hold water. It can have mulch and plants in it. Sometimes in a lot of rain, depending on the type of mulch, that mulch might rise. And so oftentimes people will use rock because it makes a nice aesthetic feature in the landscape, and it's not going to rise or shift nearly as much, even in a large rain event. And so with that, we always recommend sticking with the type of rock that's naturally kind of native to your area for a number of reasons. One, it'll just kind of give a nice natural look in your garden. The second one is that that's going to be the type of rock that you can really obtain in multiple different sizes, because combining different sizes of stone in the dry stream bed is really one of the keys to getting a nice naturalistic look, where some of the more exotic kinds of stone might only be available in one size, like 3/4 of an inch. And if you fill your whole dry stream bed with that, it's not going to look natural. It's going to look kind of funny. And then finally, last two reasons are it's also quite a bit less expensive. At stone yards, prices vary, but normally the local material is going to be about 1/3 of the price of the other materials. And then finally, that'll also allow you to also incorporate anything you might have in your yard, anything you dug up when you were digging, or any pile of rock that someone, a neighbor or someone like that might have sitting around in their yard that they'd be happy to get rid of. So I'm going to go over the different types of rock that we're going to be working with today. All the natural, sometimes called river rock, sometimes called arroyo stone. Mostly it's granite in our area in Southern California, but there's other types mixed in, and a nice range of colors from almost white to grays to browns and different patterns. So we're going to start with incorporating anything that we dug up on our site. We'll mix that in as we go. We're going to work with some larger, what might be called small boulders or very large cobblestones. Some people work with very, very big rocks in their projects, and if you want to do that and you want to put in the work, that's just fine. Generally, for me, I limit it to anything I could easily move around in a wheelbarrow and go from there. I never like to really have to rely on anything where I need big equipment that's going to cause soil compaction to get into the site, and that'll get quite a bit more expensive because when you buy stone, you pay for it by the pound. And so we'll work from everything from this size to going down to what are called cobblestones. These are maybe 4 to 6 inch rock. We have some rock that's on the smaller side of that, maybe 3 or 4 inch. Then getting down to a roughly 1 to 2 inch gravel. And then finally, at the very end, to get our natural look, we'll also top it off with just a little bit of smaller kind of pea gravel size material, so we can mix all of these different sizes and attain that nice natural look. So one quick tip before we get going any further: when you're working with stone, I always recommend wearing gloves, especially if the rock has been sitting around for any long period of time. That's a perfect place where black widows sometimes like to hang out, so best to be careful, wear a pair of gloves. So when it comes to building out the dry stream bed, what I normally start doing with the rock is kind of building up the sides with a little bit of larger stone, mixing some of the smaller stuff in between, and then as that comes together, then starting to work on the bottom, where we'll be kind of filling most of the bottom with a smaller size of gravel with larger stone kind of intermixed. And so essentially we're building up kind of loose, ideally natural looking walls. And you can make this as detailed and intricate as you want, or you could really just not worry about it much. If you just want to stack things together, fill some gaps with the smaller stone, that's going to work perfectly well. If you want to turn it into a big art project and a sculpture, you're welcome to do that as well. We'll kind of probably do it in between for this today. And so you're going to be working with your slope, and as you go, you might need to move some soil around. And it's okay if the rock is kind of exposed at the bottom, because we're going to be putting in a couple of inches of gravel anyways. So it doesn't need to look perfect there, and we'll just kind of build things up as we go with different sizes. You'll see here, we'll kind of dig it in a little bit and push in to stabilize it some. Here, if we put another big rock on top of it, there'll be a gap here, so maybe we'll grab more of a medium-sized rock and just kind of feel it out and move things around as you go. I like to have a few options of things around and kind of pull in stone as we progress. We'll take a little bit of smaller stone, and sometimes I like to just kind of toss things in here and there. If you think about how a stream bed will naturally get deposited. Now, we're not trying to make it look perfectly like something you would see out in nature, but if you think about how a stream bed works in that natural look, oftentimes the larger stone is at the base because it's more rare that a huge flood event moves larger stone, and then there's a lot of infill in between with smaller bits of gravel because it's more often that gravel is picked up during kind of smaller storm events. And so we can set our larger stone, and then we can come back and we can kind of just drop a little gravel through, and we'll do it a little bit more with the small stuff at the end and kind of start to get a somewhat natural look. One other thing that I like to do to help get that natural look is to choose a few of the larger size small boulders that we'll be using, and to kind of put them along the edge. So if you look at how the whole edge of this works, it's pretty smooth. And so what we want to do is we want to add some more variation into that edge with the stone as we go. And having a few larger pieces kind of interrupting that smooth line is an easy way to accomplish that. But what I also like to do is I like to dig these into the ground just a little bit, maybe about a third of the way into the ground, maybe up to half depending on the size of the rock. This one's pretty flat, so we'll just dig it in a little bit to help it look a little bit more settled. Depending on how much work you want to put in and the project, if it's going to be stable, you might not even need to bother doing this if you're going to have mulch or if you're going to have other gravel around. But just to show the technique, we'll dig it in a little bit. And so essentially you'll just take your shovel, and it doesn't need to be perfect, but you'll kind of roughly a little bit wider than the size of your rock. You can just dig down a little bit, and that soil might be used to pack in some rocks around the top, a little bit later on. And so we can see here we're finding a big root from the fig tree. The spacing wasn't that important. I'll just kind of move everything a little bit further. That's probably good enough to test it. Let's flip this in. We'll maybe cantilever it out so as we pack stone in underneath it, that'll all come together. And angle it so that it kind of breaks that line of the edge just a little bit. And then we'll come back in on the backside and pack in any extra soil. And so those are the basic techniques. Have fun with the process. You can feel free to get creative or just get the work done. And so our whole group is going to hop into the hole and we'll start building out all of this rock work. So we're making quite a bit of progress now, and before we do all of the sides, I want to show you quickly just how we've been putting it together. So you can see near the base where the water is coming out, how we have the larger rocks at the edge, and then the smaller gravel mostly in the bottom and kind of mixing in. And we're still going to go back and adjust it some, but that's generally the technique of how we start. And so you can see here, because we're kind of constrained in this space, it's pretty vertical. But if we just stack rock of all the same size, it's going to look very artificial. And so we're not really going as slow as some people might to really make it look totally natural and kind of really sculptural. But even if you're going quickly, what you can do is you can kind of just generally start to put things together. And then as you build, you can use any other smaller pieces, some larger pieces, some smaller pieces. You might put some gravel, kind of tuck it into the bottom to make sure that the rock is stable before you're putting more on top of it. And then eventually the bottom parts are going to get filled or covered with a little bit more of this smaller gravel. And so as you kind of stabilize things, you can find pieces that are a bit bigger, a bit smaller, and just kind of vary it up. It's easy to think about all pieces being kind of tall and vertical as you're doing sides, but every once in a while it's good to have a horizontal piece to also make it so that it doesn't become too artificial looking. We're not necessarily building a stone wall, although if you want to have that look, you definitely can. Here we're trying to have it be a little bit natural looking. When you have pieces that are kind of broken or more flat on one side, those are often really good pieces to use up against a vertical part as well. And then again, using any smaller, more wedge-like pieces underneath to kind of stabilize things. And little areas like that are perfect for, so I'm just kind of pouring gravel into it, and the gravel will find its own place to settle and also help achieve that somewhat natural look. And then we'll always take a step back at the end and do final adjustments, but we like to keep it going pretty quickly, get a lot of it done, and then go back at the end and adjust. As you get to the top, you also want to make sure that you bring the rock up high enough, especially if you're going to have wood chip mulch, a couple inches of wood chip mulch as well. But as you get towards the edge, you also want to make sure that it's not just kind of a necklace at the end. So we talked earlier about setting a boulder to kind of break that line, and I'll still continue to do that with some of the smaller rock to make sure that there's a natural kind of variation to the edge of the dry stream bed. So here's where we're at so far. A lot of the bulk of the work is done and we're getting pretty close. Just want to make some final notes about achieving a semi-natural look. Because we have a relatively small area and we needed to get some depth, we are naturally going to have a little bit of a structural wall that we need to build. So it's not totally naturalistic, but there are some things that you can do towards the end to kind of just vary it up a little more. I always like reserving some of the rock that just got dug up when I was digging and just tossing them in at the end to just vary up the size of the gravel. That's going to be in the bottom of the dry stream bed. I also like, you can see that we've already done quite a bit of it, just taking some of a medium-sized gravel and just kind of filling in here or there, doing some extra work, even tapering it off into the landscape a little bit. It's really easy to end up with kind of like a necklace effect at the edge of your dry stream bed. And so one thing you can do is have rocks going at various angles, but then you can also come back and just do little piles of gravel, even some branches or other things like that, where you have the room to do it. And then I always like taking some real small gravel as well and just kind of tossing it here or there. You also want to make sure that you don't have a lot of big holes in between your rocks. Those are spots where it's easy for weeds to come up. So you can also come in and you can do little bits of fill here and there so that there's not as much exposed dirt in those areas. And over time, this might settle out a bit, especially after the first time it rains. And so you have a chance to go back and make adjustments. And it can be kind of a gradual process from being good enough at the beginning to eventually being something that you really like. Now, additionally, one way to make this kind of nice and a little bit more natural looking is to mix in some cobblestone and even some small boulders out into the planting area. We're not going to do that today because we're going to wait till we bring in our plants that are going to be at the edge of this dry stream bed, and then we'll do our planting and our final kind of boulder work, a few more cobblestones, bringing the drip irrigation back through to water those plants, and then doing a little bit of wood chip mulch in the area where we don't have rocks. And those will be all the finishing touches on this dry stream bed.